Welcome to the Nightmare Dungeon. How tough are you?
How tough am I? How tough am I?
Yes, so? With 60% crit resist. Right this way. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Oh yes, my fellow sorcerers, hello and welcome to what you knew was surely on the way. Both because it's obscenely powerful in Season 1, and you have been asking for my take on Ice Shards with the Malignant Hearts and the changes we have had and how that shuffles the general core playstyle and setup around. And yeah, it's not going to be as crazy different as the new Arclash take with its speedy speed, honestly, and its extra focus on crackling energy and such forth, but that doesn't mean that it's not the most potent, just pure damage pumping sorcerer build that we have access to. My Arclash remains the champion of speed farming, but this undoubtedly is the king of pushing difficult content with just how many numbers it can pump out from a relatively safe distance at range with infinite mana, achieved in a way that leaves more space open for damage bumps than ever before, with lots of backup options, with the newly awesome buffed Deep Freeze, which works wonderfully with the Barber, which of course this is using as it is the single most broken heart, you know this by now, but on Ice Shards, a highly damaging single target crit build, well, Barber goes a little bit mental. It really does. And we've also smoothed out the AoE weakness too with an enchantment switcheroo that I'm sure you're seeing. And yeah, I mean, comfortably melting through a tier 55-ish or so that, yes, has a negative 60% crit damage affix on it. So I'm 60% weaker than I should be in this footage you're seeing, which is certainly something awesome to keep in mind, as level 75, even with the tweak down to nightmares, says all it needs to. And against lower stuff, it's just a little bit unfair. Like, the damage is absolutely bonkers. It is cuckoo bananas. Sorry, I apologize for my language there. You didn't need to hear that. So ultimately, if you are a fan of Ice Shards, you will be a big fan of this version of Ice Shards, and you will find yourself more powerful than you have ever felt before. Especially with the extra infusion of actual freeze time I have put in here without the need for Frostburn, and that is really nice to play off too, as freeze is very good in Ice Shards. Everything is better and more potent, and you know, less them killing you when they're an icy statue waiting to be blown apart. So how are we achieving all this then? The skill tree then gives us our jumping off point as usual, and we begin with 2 points in Firebolt, both to get to the core skills, and yes, it is our first enchantment slot because this is a hyper-focused crit build, which means we do get the most out of Burning Synergy and more specifically Devouring Blaze, as boring as that is. Then to the cores, where we get the core in Ice Shards, the whole point of this, and yes, Vulnerable as the far and away superior option for this skill. Then we get our second enchantment slot in Frozen Orb. Now you might have an initial reaction here of, what? So no Ice Shards enchantment? No, Frozen Orb in its buffed higher chance to happen state, coupled with how fast we cast Ice Shards, so how often we trigger it, adds so much more to this build in terms of both damage and utility than just free Ice Shards at frozen enemies. And I will explain more in detail why that is when we get to the actual gameplay guide how to play it section, but please trust me, a lot of research and testing has gone into this, and the process is true. Then we get greater, as we want that extra vulnerable for, again, reasons I'll go into. And then lastly, this point here. This is kind of a free-floating point. How we have this set up, you have 1 point left over. Put it wherever you like. I've just put some extra mana so I can spend more time above 100 mana. That's just fine. Then to the defensives, where, as always, we say, yes, please, may I have them all. I wouldn't want anything crazy like build variety. Whew, that scares me. Flame Shield to Shimmering, that emergency immune button. Teleport to Shimmering for the damage reduction, movement, and raiment grouping, the best skill we have that isn't a damaging one. And Ice Armor for extra barrier, extra survivability. And then Frost Nova for more vulnerable after we do the grouping at close range. 1 rank in elemental attunement, so the effect can happen and will happen every 10 seconds with how much we're critting, with how much lucky hit we have. And then we get even more lucky hit with precision magic, and then our duo of defensives in mana shield and protection. More barrier, more damage reduction, very much things that we need on our squishy sorcerer selves. Then over in Mastery Land, we just want that devouring blaze and get that crit multiplier. Then we go over to the quartet of every call damage based build basically will get, because they're all just really solid passives. More elite damage is great, more damage to Chilled and Frozen is great, and thanks to Frozen Orb enchantment, we actually have access to Chilled in an Ice Shards build, because Ice Shards don't chill by default, and that changes things in a really significant way, especially when we get to Paragon board. Then we get Frigid Breeze, which is our biggest source of mana regen, and in fact, our only source of straight up extra burst regen, and then Icy Touch for more vulnerable damage. Everything is always vulnerable. And then Deep Freeze for our emergency, oh my god, I'm dying, I just want a breather, and to reset all of our cooldowns for even more barriers. And the damage that this does, coupled with the Heart of the Barber, is room clearing, and it's fantastic to both see and use. Then our lovely passive of choice is Shatter for more pops of burst from frozen enemies. And we will have a lot more frozen enemies than usual Ice Shards, as in usual Ice Shards, the only way to really freeze is your Frost Nova, whereas now, the chill build-up from Frozen Orb will be freezing enemies left and right, which adds so much more versatility and well-roundedness, I mean, obviously, it's a sphere shape, I'm sorry, to this build, and it very much needed it. So, that's where we're at skills-wise. And then you've got your bars set up as per usual like this. I feel like at this point you really don't need me to say, press Flame Shield when you might otherwise die. Press Ice Armor when you might otherwise die. And also to keep your barrier buffs up, like Lucky Hit with Barrier. And so on and such forth. Generically then, you have 2 main ways of playing this. Sniping enemies on the edge of your screen and just detonating them there, which is very safe and very effective. Or teleporting on top of them, grouping them, freezing them, hopping back, and then shooting through the pile. Both work, and depends on the situation, how high the Nightmare Dungeon is, if you're pushing or just farming, but the usual jump back and burst, and I mean, it's just so silly how much damage this does to your level content in the open world, by the way. Like, it's just a death laser beam. It's such instant destruction of everything that you fire. Oh, and you are seeing that Frozen Orb enchant do work. With how quickly, look, you turret out to these Ice Shards, and how long range the Frozen Orb enchant is, it just stacks up so much goodness for you. As you might well be aware by now, as I've explained it a few times, the Frozen Orb enchant is superior to casting it yourself. It will stop on enemies, and it will go greater distance. 2 things the base spell just doesn't know how to do. So when you're firing at enemies at the very edge of your screen, and then Frozen Orb goes out and joins them, you start stacking chill, you add extra vulnerable to the enemies not being hit by your Ice Shards, and that works lovely. So yeah, let's actually talk about this Frozen Orb enchant. The main thing that it does is twofold. The AoE and extra damage is obviously great, but the 2 main utilities it brings is it chills, and that means we can access chill-based synergies. It also adds vulnerable to everything and not just the thing you're shooting with ice shards, and it's incredibly good at making lucky hits happen, which means Frozen Orb is the primary activator of Frigid Breeze on groups of enemies, giving you monstrous amounts of mana to work with, meaning that we need less mana management on our gear. So it solves so many problems and weaknesses that Ice Shards usually has by its existence as our enchantment. And I'll be honest with you, the Ice Shards enchantment isn't really that good in an Ice Shards build. Ironic, I know, but look, what is the main purpose of it? To fire Ice Shards at frozen enemies. When are enemies frozen in normal Ice Shards? When you Frost Nova them. That's it, because Ice Shards itself doesn't have chill. And if you've jumped onto a group of enemies and then Frost Nova'd them, yes, it's very powerful and fun to see the sudden burst of Ice Shards detonate them all, especially with Shatter stacking as they do. But it's not needed. You can teleport, freeze, hop, and then blast through. It takes half a second longer, but it achieves the same result, especially with Barber. You don't need an enchantment slot dedicated to insta-deleting groups with a Raiment teleport onto Frost Nova, when we can use that enchantment slot to get a much better build in every single other area that we care about, and thus we have done. And even without that Ice Shards enchant, because of how strong the Barber is, if we actually get a cheeky little group of enemies here, you can see that you don't actually need it to achieve a very similar effect. For example, teleport, freeze, and pop! See? I didn't even need the Ice Shard enchant. Yes, it happened a bit slower because we had to wait for the Barber counter, but it really does kind of make that enchantment superfluous in my mind. The combination of Barber and the buffed Frozen Orb, both enchant and based skill itself. So, let's talk aspects, gear, affixes, stats, and firstly, your gems, rubies up top, and emeralds down below. So, Ice Shards, piercing, and doing less damage for the privilege. Yes, this is required in every Ice Shards build, it's not a surprise to see, make sure you have it. On our boots, you want Shared Misery. This is so much better with the Frozen Orb enchant, as the chill will freeze people, and then once you have one frozen enemy at range, this will spread it to everyone else, and then all of your frozen-based synergies will kick in, and everything just dies. Then we want Disobedience on your legs for that extra armor, it's very, very useful, and on your gloves, your critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed. This is to make you turret even faster with Ice Shards, which then makes you throw out even more Frozen Orbs because you have more chances per time to do so. It's so noticeable. Raiment of the Infinite, a required part of every endgame Sorcerer build because it's just too strong. The teleport group stun, phenomenal, and on your helmet you want Frost Blitz because we want as much Frost Nova action, that AoE, freeze, and vulnerable, and yes, the barrier it gives you as possible. On our focus, we have the Frozen Orb aspect, so it actually stays at the end of its path and explodes a few more times, stops on the enemies, it's what makes it usable, and those extra pulses trigger your lucky hits, which restores your mana, which makes things vulnerable, which compounds, and then it freezes and chills, and so on and so forth, and it's just glorious. Then on your necklace, you want the Elementalist for more crit chance above 100 mana. About half your Ice Shards will be above 100 mana, so in a max roll this would be 30% crit chance, which is a lot from one aspect and why it is here. Then you want your usual control. Things are going to be frozen and stunned a lot with both Raiment and your just general freezing shenanigans, and this is a nice increase, even if it's nowhere near as good as it was in its prime. How I miss you, original control. And then more vulnerable damage with a barrier. All our damage is vulnerable damage, because Ice Shard makes everything vulnerable, Frozen Orb makes everything vulnerable, and we permanently have a barrier from all of our barrier-producing abilities and passives in protection, so this is a big increase, especially with vulnerable being its own super powerful bucket. That works very nicely then, and when we look at Malignant Hearts, that sweet, sweet Barber is our Wrathful. I've gone for the full 4-second one on this because, yes, as it turns out, if you pump enough damage into your target and it has more damage stored up than total health, it will pop early, so you're not losing too much with the max roll here. However, that is not true completely. There are plenty of times where you will have enough damage stored up that if you stop attacking and wait for them to pop, they will still die. Because let's say you've done damage for 2 seconds, 2 more seconds go by, which means 2 more seconds of multiplying by 14%. That's what makes it reach enough to kill it, and then it does. So you can still use your judgment here and stop attacking things a second or two early if they're just random trash mobs that will die from the multiplying up. Use your best judgment, but the 4 is certainly not as much of a weakness against random groups of weak enemies as I previously suspected. Then we want this, the Dark Dance. This is really lovely. We have so much barrierage and survivability in this build that we can afford to spend 200 health out of nearly 5k every 5 seconds. The extra damage on the attack is nice, but what it mainly does is helps us smooth out our mana without needing to go too far into mana management, as every 5 seconds getting a free cast really is nice. It just kind of takes the edge off. Then we have Tell Rashes, because of course we do, it's just too powerful. That stacking increase per element. We get lightning from our teleport, we get fire from Firebolt and Flame Shield, and we get frost from, you know, the main damage that we do. And then we also get shadow for 4 stacks permanently in this build from the Barber damage itself as its shadow, and it all works beautifully. If you are doing really easy content, I would suggest using Iceheart Briars instead of Disobedient Legs, as it just makes things better and quicker. However, if you are pushing, you want the Disobedience on, and if you are really pushing, then put a Revenge Ring instead of Dark Dance, and that will make things much better there too. But unless you're struggling, you can leave full damage setup. Affix-wise then, what are we after? Resource generation, mana cost reduction, and more max mana. We don't need chance on hit for resource generation, thanks to Frozen Orb's interaction with our mana regen against vulnerable targets passive. Then you want ranks of Devouring Blaze, you want ranks of defensive skills, Ice Shards, and Frozen Orbs. Sadly, I wish this 15 all stats was Ice Shards. That would be such a god tier gloves, but the other 3 rolls are certainly plenty enough to be getting on with. Then after that, you want cooldown reduction on mass, and then you want attack speed, followed by lucky hit chance, followed by crit chance, followed by crit damage, and then all of your other damage increases, like int, like close, like core skill damage, etc. Make sure you have your wand and focus as your weaponry setup of choice, and you are laughing. Breakpoint wise, as you can see, we're approaching 40% crit chance on top of Elementalist, which is really healthy. A bit of extra attack speed is very nice too, and then a huge amount of critical strike damage, which is really important here. Going down to the lucky hit, you want to be approaching 50% just naturally, and then mana gen, you want to get above 50%. 16 a second just passively is really good, and then 30% mana cost reduction and 30% cooldown reduction is also ideally the goal, so I'm a little bit shy here. Then we only have the Paragon board left to go over, so that is indeed what we shall do. Starting at the base board, follow my path, and your first glyph is Elementalist. Getting that extra boost in non-physical damage is really good, and the Fire Cold Lightning stacking to stack on top of Tell Rashes is really felt. Moving up to get an old familiar friend, it is the Burning Instinct board for all of that burning synergy, now that we're using Firebolt and Devouring Blaze again. Head over and get the Smoldering Embers cluster, get the Cinders cluster, and then in your next glyph you want Destruction. More critical strike damage and more stacking damage from crits. This works wonderfully, obviously, with Ice Shards. Head up and get the Kindling cluster, and then when you have more points than I do, you do want to bob over here and get the bit of armor that we can get from Paragon as Sorcerer, this whole setup here. Then head up and left into Icefall, straight down in this orientation to the Cryomancy cluster, and then you will creep up and get Icefall itself, and then we'll leave this board for now to go completely up here, exit, and this is the Frigid Fate, the vulnerable board. Get this cluster on the right, the Oppressive, for all of that vulnerable damage, and then we go get the glyph slot where Tactician takes its place. More vulnerable damage is excellent, and the permanent damage increase from defensives, which we are spamming, also excellent. Get weakness and its surrounding magic vulnerable damage nodes. I would be doing more here if I had the points, obviously activating Tactician, but sadly I don't. But once you have activated Tactician, you are done on Frigid Fate. You want to go back to Icefall. Head up from the Icefall and get the Keeper of Winter. Then you can go around here and get the extra non-physical damage with Polar Rime. Then you can go get the Glyph slot alongside Frost for even more damage to chilled enemies, which remember we now can use thanks to the Frozen Orb enchantment, which is glorious. And then in this glyph socket, you are going to put your control to get that extra damage to stunned and frozen from, well, all of the stuns and freezing we are doing. So there is that. That gives you a lot of points to spend when you do indeed get them, and will give you a brilliantly powerful version of Ice Shards that has all the bells and whistles, covers its own weaknesses, and gets the job done in the most magnificent high damage millions blow up one shot of ways. It really is satisfying to play Ice Shards with Barber, and I really am enjoying it, even if I do desperately miss the pure literal speed of Arclash. I will be next back after 1.1.1 with the Sorcerer buffs to tackle Fireball and Meteor and Chain Lightning and all of the now hopefully looking viable ways to play Sorcerer, so that is super exciting. For now then, like you've enjoyed this, subscribe and hit the bell for more, consider supporting the future of the channel on Patreon down below, and until we meet again, a goodbye.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.